Are you happy or sad this morning, Pele?
I'm tired.
Okay, that's no kind of answer because the question we're asking on this episode is, can poetry make you happy? Gosh, that's a big question for a little podcast, isn't it? Can poetry make you happy? Pele, before we plunge in headlong, as it were, what would your one word answer be? Can poetry make you happy? Yes, no? I guess I would allow a maybe.
Self.
Well, that's very cryptic. Self. I was expecting you to say yes, really suddenly, instantly. Go on, ask me what my one word response would be.
What's your one word response to the question, Rich?
This doesn't sound at all contrived, does it? My one word response would be yes, which doesn't sound like a wholehearted yes. Certainly isn't a no, so is probably closest to a maybe.
I think
Anyway,
I think the question that we've asked for this podcast episode is sort of a trick question. And the reason we've asked the trick question is because it triggers an investigation into the keys to what a poem's function and a poet's function is. And I say self because we in this society have become almost slightly, I don't know what the listeners would call it, maybe they should ask themselves the question. But we've become blunted, I think, by social media, by tragedies that surround us with such immediacy every day from far and wide. And that poetry is a way to find good soil in your own life, to till your own ground, and to find a happiness and a stillness that is utterly and completely your own. I'm sitting at my desk here. I'm surrounded by portraits of these great figures in poetry: Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Coleridge. And I wanted to say that I thought committing to poetry, giving yourself to it, just even if it's half an hour a week, is like being a member of a really exclusive club. And you decide on the furniture in the room, and you decide on the people that are part of that club.
a trick question. I was convinced it was just that because when you suggested a list of poets that we should talk about, I thought, well, these are about as far removed from happiness as it would be possible to be. John Clare
Tell us about John
spent
Clare, Rich.
spent a third of his life in an asylum, a lunatic asylum as it was called at the time. 23, 24, 25 years, far from a happy place. John Keats, you know better than I, died young in tragic circumstances, aged 26. Emily Dickinson, I don't think I've ever seen a picture of Emily Dickinson happy, with a smile on her face. She was a virtual recluse in her own home in Massachusetts, I think it was, for many, many years. And then Sylvia Plath on the list as well. And sadly, we all know what happened to her, taking her own life at age 30. So not an obviously happy bunch of poets. So explain why you've chosen those ones for us to explore this notion of whether poetry can make you happy.
Well, it's the classic poetry reality, isn't it? It has a mercurial element that only if you step into it, like with Dante and Virgil, touring around these scenes of the world, whether bad or good, you find things out. And I think it's exploring something about the world, about your existence. And these poets that we mention, they weren't necessarily only unhappy. Poetry is a spectrum, a palette of colours that, visible on a Titian painting. If you stared long enough, you could see the variables in the texture of the paint, like you can see the variables in an individual's own life. And Sylvia Plath was extremely happy with Ted Hughes for quite a long time and was very productive and wrote extraordinary verse born of her joy and pain living simultaneously. Now, you can't get much more interesting answer to the question than that.
And Keats his view was that happiness was only possible because of sadness, that one needed
Mm.
both happiness and sadness, joy and sorrow, I think is the way he put it. In order to experience joy, one had to experience sorrow. The two were, if you like, I don't think he put it this way, so I'm paraphrasing, but two sides of the same coin in a sense, a human emotion that can be expressed as sorrow or as joy. And there was, boy, plenty of sorrow in Keats'
Oh God,
life, in
he had it
Plath's
in
life, in
spades.
Dickinson's life.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
happiness, I think it's distorted over time, hasn't it? It's something with a capital H now that needs to be shouted from the rooftops or aspired to, whereas to me it's something that lives alongside lots of other things, and it defines and dictates its music when it wants to, and that poetry is a way of tapping into that orchestra of the self, and that leads to happiness. I thought in the fingerprint vein, I'd just say something about me because everybody has a different relationship to poetry. It directs you as you are and your experience. And the reason that I turned to it and that it has made me happy is because when I was in my formative years at my school, I was in an extraordinarily difficult situation, a transaction with my peers, which sort of defined this language that I had to be submissive to them and I had to sort of earn my place in my class. And the residue of that has been that I feel I always need to earn my place in the world, that I need to show that I'm allowed to be. And that's such a crazy language to live your life with on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure lots of our listeners know exactly what I'm talking about. And that poetry, when I encountered Plath, really, she was the first poet apart from Tennyson, whom my mother used to read us at night as a lullaby equivalent, showed me that the language sort of earns you. You sit with a poem or you sit with the words that you are trying to find a space beyond all that imposition, and that you are recognized by language and that you recognize yourself through your choice of language. Now, Rich, I know that we together have looked up some statistics, especially for this show, in terms of neurological benefits. Shall we just get scientific for a minute to back up my points?
There's not been many scientific studies, as far as I can tell, around poetry specifically, and most of them have followed hard on the heels of our physiological response to music. But there was one particular study, I think it was back in 2017, where presumably they plugged people's heads into sort of brainwave monitors and put things that went ping onto them, and then read them poetry or asked them to read poetry, and it lit up sections of the brain that are associated with our reward mechanism, the dopamines and all of that kind of stuff, the things that might be a physiological indicator of a biochemical indicator even of happiness. And that was fascinating. And what was most fascinating was that they, in this experiment or another one, they compared the response of the physiological response of poetry enthusiasts with non-poetry enthusiasts. Now, one might expect those who are enthusiastic about poetry, people like us, to have our brains light up and to be, having goosebumps and for our hairs to stand on end when we read a particularly lovely piece of poetry. But this response was happening to a very significant level in non-poetry enthusiasts as
Wow.
well. So there's something about poetry that can even affect those who aren't into poetry in a big way. It was like 75-80% of people who were non-poetic were reacting in this way, which I found fascinating.
That's fascinating. And, I read in terms of dopamine, the dopamine issue, which obviously is such an important issue at the moment because I'm sure many of you also know that when you look at your phone or you check a text or an Instagram post, that releases dopamine. But that dopamine is released when you know a poem, just before the last line that you love comes. So, I mean, take your pick. You want to scroll through Instagram. I do it myself too much. and release dopamine, or do you want to actually be the director of your own film, of your own life, and choose your poem and create that scene and your moment where you have decided on the language that will define your hit? And the other thing is sensation. Poetry, does it make you feel better? No, but we are our brains and beings are and neurological pathways are surrounded and woven together with sensation every day, memory, experience, and that poetry may not create the sensation, but writing it helps you to find the language for that sensation, which pins it down, which contains it, which gives it an architecture for your own life. So, Rich, you were talking about that just now, weren't you?
Yeah. Pinning it down, I think, is a really nice way of putting it, Pele, that I wouldn't say that poetry has made me directly happy. In fact, the business of writing poetry in some respects is torture, very opposite of happiness, or equally, and at times, surprisingly, strangely, emotionless, if that makes sense, because one's so busy about finding the right words for one's emotions that actually you're not feeling them, you're trying to articulate them and stick them down. But I'm with Keats. Happiness requires sadness. Emotions are relative to one another, and they're not able to exist in isolation. And if I think of my own sadness, for example, following the violent death of my mother, to be happy again requires one to stop being sad in the first place. It's a kind of journey, and poetry has stopped me being sad rather than made me happy.
It's like a kind of contract that you wrote, isn't it? It's a deal that you did with your own experience.
Yeah, and more than a contract or a deal, it's almost like putting down words onto a page or a screen into a poem, into prose potentially as well, and that once they're there, captured on a page in a document, in a poem, that they are safe. It's like locking them away into a little safety deposit box or some kind of trinket, and then being happy to leave that trinket to one side to
Or
go about
treasure.
one's daily life. A treasure. I think it's a really good word, treasure. Thank you. And knowing that when you come back to that treasure trove, to that safety deposit box, your emotions will be in there, but you can get on with your life because that's where they are safely stored. So I think that it isn't that poetry can make you happy, to go back to the sort of question that we asked right at the beginning of this episode, but that it is a necessary step towards happiness if one's starting position is sadness.
So, Rich, yeah, just to go deeper into your experience, and let's get on with the poetry, because it speaks better than either of us could ever do in conversation, is that you have a particular poem. Well, I actually mentioned it, that you wrote in the middle of this maelstrom, of this hurricane of an event. Would you like to talk about it in terms of this transaction? I'm sorry to keep using scientific words. I'm sort of doing it on purpose.
Yeah, the one in particular that you mentioned is called Tears in a Care Home Car Park. I mean, perhaps I ought to rewind a little bit then. Maybe some regular listeners who know what happened to my mum. She was killed by another resident who intruded into her care home bedroom and bashed her around the head and body many times with a walking stick. And my mother succumbed to those injuries half a day later. So this poem is one of those where I was able to put my feelings down into a poem and to leave them there and get on with my life on a day-to-day basis at the time. And it's called Tears in a Care Home Car Park, and I hope it makes that point of a safety deposit box for one's feelings, which can stop you feeling sad and can be a part of the journey back towards happiness. Tears in a Care Home Car Park. A facade, clay bricks, light brown, plain, wire cut, institutional, the mortar holding them together while inside everything is falling apart. A sarcophagus for the double dead, calcium, bone white, brittle, ready to snap, and on the sticky black tarmac below, parked cars, caught like flies in a trap. A door opens and out pours a flood of tears, a wreck pulled from the deep, the drowned man asleep at the wheel.
It's a fantastic poem. And you wrote that in the car, is that right? In the car park, in your notebook?
Scribbled in a notebook and edited quite heavily subsequently, but the feelings were important to get down at the time. I mean, you can't carry on. It brings a lump to my throat now, which you probably shouldn't. It was 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, time capsules, aren't they, poems as well?
But it is a time capsule, and it takes you back to that point. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think just back to Keats for a second, if you don't mind. I
Of
think
course, not at all.
poem he would have really admired because of its stark beauty. You know, truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That is all there is on earth and all you need to know. Your poem is an example of that in our contemporary world. But Keats was a pharmacist. He started as a pharmacist and went on to Guy's Hospital to assist with the operations because he was so good at it. You know, he was so intelligent and probably incredibly sensitive, which helped because he was porous and could absorb, you know, all these elements during the procedures. And it was too much for him. He didn't like it. It distressed him, which was the other side of the coin, I imagine. And he developed the idea that poetry was similar to that healing and medicine, healing poetry could run alongside it and have as powerful an effect. Now, that's definitely a flag up for poetry makes you happy in the terms of it's wholesome, it's good soil in your life. Now, we are quite well, Richard particularly, you're quite connected to the poetry pharmacy, aren't you? Which I think is a brilliant parallel to have Keats having been a pharmacist and now they have 3 branches in the UK. Do you want to talk about how they might administer joy?
Yeah, they certainly do administer joy. I mean, the idea of the poetry pharmacy is that you are prescribed a verse of poetry in a phial, a glass bottle that you can take out and read and can change your state of mind, sadness to happiness, for example. And it looks very much like an old-fashioned apothecary. Branches, as you say, 3 of them in the UK, York, Bishop's Castle near us in Shropshire, and one in Oxford Street in London. So absolutely a lovely parallel with Keats starting out in his working life as a pharmacist. I think it's the community, for me, of the poetry pharmacy that brings joy. The idea that we get together once every couple of months and read out our poetry, however good or bad it is, in front of a supportive audience, an open mic, in other words, and that there is a great deal of satisfaction and, yes, joy to be derived from listening to other people's poetic musings and to have a chance to give your own a bit of a run out. So poetry can work in all sorts of different ways. I don't think it's something that can be necessarily enjoyed in splendid isolation. Although,
I don't know
thinking
about
back to
that.
Clare, well, I was going to say thinking back to John Clare and his incarceration in the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, as it was then called. That was a fairly
Yes.
lonely existence.
Sorry, just to say, you know, that is something else that you can create your own joy in whatever environment you find yourself in. So, you know, you sitting in the car park after this terrible tragedy, and John Clare in his lunatic asylum, being able to create the landscape using the landscape that he mourned and missed so much, using language. And, you know, you can manufacture joy writing and reading poetry.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that really does apply to John Clare. His happy place, to use modern parlance, was clearly the landscape around his Northamptonshire home, the home of his childhood and his early adulthood. That was changed massively by the Industrial Revolution, by the Agricultural Revolution that ran alongside it, by
Something we're going through, an
the
equivalent now.
enclosures and similar huge ructions, and he was able to go back to that happy place when he was incarcerated in first High Beach Asylum and then in Northampton General Lunatic Asylum. And poetry was the kind of time machine, if you like, that enabled him to travel back to his Northamptonshire happy place, back through time and through space. And All Nature Has a Feeling. Most academics reckon it was written around about 1845, which was 2 or 3 years after he entered psychiatric care, I guess is the way to put it. It's a short poem, and forgive me if I read the whole thing out because I think it makes that point. All nature has a feeling is the title in the first line. All nature has a feeling, woods, fields, brooks, a life eternal, and in silence they speak happiness, my emphasis, speak happiness beyond the reach of books. There's nothing mortal in them. Their decay is the green life of change, to pass away and come again in blooms revivified. Its birth was heaven, eternal is its stay, and with the sun and moon shall still abide beneath their day and night and heaven wide.
Absolutely beautiful. Even in the pause when you finish, I can feel his internal, the trees and the memories of his place, sense of place, and I can feel him back there in that cell.
And it's interesting that the detail that he renders his poems with. So the Nightingale's Nest is reckoned to be one of the most detailed observations of nature, and sort of was a precursor of modern ornithology in some respects. He talks in great detail about the nightingale and its habit and its nest and its russet brown and fairly dowdy plumage and so on. So the poems he wrote when he was in that place are far more detailed, and some of that detail has been stripped away by his incarceration, but poetry is still able to get him back there. And the great thing, of course, is that it doesn't just take him back to where he was happy, his happy place, as they say, but it also enables us to visit there. We're not revisiting, we're going there for the first time. And isn't that marvellous that we can get on the John Clare time machine and go back to Helpston, to Northamptonshire of the 18th century?
You know, we're becoming so separate from our own, from the ground beneath our feet. And John Clare could create a ground beneath his feet. And in terms of nature, sorry, I'm just going to carry on for a second because I just want to talk about the poem that I know that a lot of listeners might be thinking about right now, which is the great contemporary poem that speaks to human nature rather than to the landscape. And it's Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. I'm just going to read it. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clear blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Now, I think that's poetry talking to the poet lover or the poet novice or the poet. And I admire it deeply, but I think it's a gateway. Listeners, use it as a gateway to seeing the joy ahead with other great poetry and older poetry. And she's speaking to you, she's guiding you by the hand. She wants to take you to the rest of what poetry can give you. Do you agree, Rich?
I'd not heard that before. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'll be reading that again we put links to the poems that we talk about, the ones that we read, onto the Pele's Poetry Podcast website. So I'll certainly be making my own way there to read Wild Geese by Mary Oliver.
It's a much
Gorgeous.
loved poem.
Yeah, and a gateway, perhaps, permission to get into difficult poets. I say difficult advisedly because you know much more about Emily Dickinson than I do. But of course, when we come up with an idea for a program, we need to do a little bit of digging
She's always
around.
there.
Always there. Well, there she is on your shelf, or one of her books at least. And it seems to me, as I said at the start, she was far from happy, obsessed with death, according to one literary scholar. Her poems collectively, I think there was about 1,800 of them over her shortish life. She died age 55. She refers to crucifixion, drowning. I'm having to read this list, sorry. Crucifixion, drowning, hanging, suffocation, freezing, premature burial, shooting, stabbing, and guillotinage. I mean, what's she doing? What's she doing on our list of poets? About whether poetry can make you happy. Which would you choose as representative of if you had to choose just one?
Yes, I mean, I love it when you throw me a curveball, Rich. I mean, that is, again, just like we were saying about Plath and Clare, that is one very small facet of an extraordinary cosmology of joy that she, over her study and priestesshood almost, uncovered for us. And I feel like she sat in this meditation all those years and wrote all those poems as a sort of gift to us. She sort of sacrificed herself so we could be happy, or we could learn to look. And this is the one that I've picked. Obviously, I picked one out before we started. Actually, it picked me. It's number 1171. On the world you coloured morning painted rose. Idle his vermilion, aimless crept the glows over realms of orchards. I the day before conquered with the robin. Misery, how fair till your wrinkled finger shored the sun away. Midnight's awful pattern in the goods of day. Please, listeners, find it and spend an hour unpacking that, and you'll come out of it a different human being, I promise.
Because on the first reading you think, oh, blimey, that's far from happy. But on subsequent readings, as you say, as you unpack it, you might actually find something that is helping you towards happiness.
Yes, I also, in the same breath, I'd like to talk about Rachel Kelly, a great advocate of mental health, working today vehemently and passionately, believing how poetry can help your life. This is all rooted in her experiences, deep depression, which lasted 4 years while she was bringing up 4 children. And she turned to poetry to find breath and to find light, and wrote a memoir about it called Black Rainbow, which is another fantastic book, which I recommend you all read. And like Keats, she was saying that you must prescribe words to yourself instead of pills. And in this Black Rainbow book, she lays out each poem, and she has such great taste in poetry, the poems that helped save her life, basically, her own recovery. And the poems that welcomed her distress, that could contain this heavy load of sadness that was protracted over years. And one of the poems that I read with her at the Ledbury Poetry Festival, she asked me to read the poems as she described her experience, was Love 3 by George Herbert, which is love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. Very famous. I think we've read it on the podcast already, so look it up, everybody. Anyway, I'd just like to, raise a flag to Rachel Kelly.
So what are we going to end on? Are we going to end on a little bit of John Clare? Are we going to end on Keats, Dickinson, Plath?
I'm afraid we're going to end on Plath, unless you want to.
No, the choice is yours.
Well,
Plath.
I think because she is the totem. She wrote a great poem called Totem, by the way, of joy and pain for me and for lots of women, and I just adore her work. And I'll start before I read an extract from this poem by her. I want to read by a quote with a quote by Heaney, who says, "Poetry makes space for the life we actually live, rather than the life we are supposed to be living." Now, I don't know about you, Rich, but that I think is the most liberating thing for me when I write a poem. I am in my moment, writing things as they really are for me, my private self, and no one can touch it or tell me I'm wrong or take it away from me. Now, that involves telling the truth, and Sylvia Plath wrote this most wonderful poem. It's one of my favourites, called Tulips. While she was in hospital, somebody bought her a bunch of tulips, and she's lying in bed and she's looking at this bunch of flowers. Now, the reason I've chosen this one is because it describes it exactly. It's a bit like someone brings you a bunch of flowers in hospital or in any situation, and you're meant to be happy about it, but you feel differently from happy. And her poem is a description of how these tulips make her really feel. I'm just going to start from verse 5. I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. How free it is. You have no idea how free. The peacefulness is so big it dazes you. And it asks nothing, a name tag, a few trinkets. It is what the dead close on, finally. I imagine them shutting their mouths on it like a communion tablet. The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me, even though through the gift paper I could hear them breathe lightly through their white swaddlings like an awful baby. Their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They are subtle. They seem to float, though they weigh me down, upsetting me with their sudden tongues and their colour, a dozen red lead sinkers round my neck. Nobody watched me before. Now I am watched. The tulips turn to me and the window behind me, where once a day the light slowly widens and slowly thins, and I see myself, flat, ridiculous, a cut paper shadow between the eye of the sun and the eyes of the tulips. And I have no face. I have wanted to efface myself. The vivid tulips eat my oxygen.